So, I decided to play a Wild West game. So, just normal Wild West stuff. That's what the Wild West looked like, right? Wild Arms is a franchise. Was a franchise. Well, it's complicated. There's certainly no obvious endpoint or statements of it ending as far as I know, but it just kind of dropped out of the face of the earth after releasing its last game so far on the PS2 roughly 14 years ago, just 1 month after the release of the PS3. Not that many people were jumping at the beat to get a PS3 at the time, given how expensive it was and how barren the launch library was for quite a while. So it was probably a good time to still keep releasing a game on the PS2. But we're not talking about that game though. We're going several games back all the way to talk about 3. Why 3? Well, it's kind of a simple story. I kind of like westerns, I like JRPGs, and I definitely have a fascination with turn-based games, so knowing that a franchise mixing all of those together existed and I hadn't tried out a single game yet, well, I knew I immediately had to jump on that train and I decided to go to the all-around highest rated, most recommended, and even available right now on the PS4 game, and that one was Wild Arms 3. And what better place to start talking about a game than the beginning of the game? Well, there's plenty of good places, but it's always nice to start from the beginning, at least when a game's opening moments are unique and well executed enough to be talked about, and let me tell ya, Wild Arms 3 opening segment is definitely something special. You are introduced to the world of Filgaia by zooming in from a distance to a train that's just chugging along in the middle of the night, like trains usually do, before focusing on a young woman reading a book, at which point you are also introduced to the game's charming and frankly almost timeless cel-shaded look. Only the textures / shading have this weird, slightly faded, slightly scratchy edge to them that makes you feel like you're looking at illustration on an old western tale book. Which is very neat and it looks really pretty, but I digress, let us go to the next point. The young woman decides to close the book and take a little nap, but she is rudely interrupted when the train screeches to a halt. She goes to investigate a suspicious wagon that apparently holds incredibly valuable cargo, and BAM! Suddenly from every direction, colorful characters emerge and enter the classical Mexican standoff before the game freeze frames and suddenly displays that the cool ass shit that just happened was our setup for a character select screen. Hot damn, if that isn't the best possible way to open a western styled game, I don't know what is. What might not be clear at first though is that you're not selecting a character to be your main character or even the party's leader. You're selecting a character to view their prologue backstory and learn how they came to be on the train, pointing their guns at each other. And while you can view them on any order, you do need to view all of them to proceed to the actual game. What makes this for a good introduction, both from a story point plus from a gameplay perspective sort of way, is that depending on the JRPG, you might begin with only one character in your party as the game introduces its mechanics, and on many JRPGs, you might not even have a full party until several hours in. Wild Arms 3 cuts that time by having you play as each character on a one-man party, introducing the game's mechanics and each character's own unique quirks into an easily digestible way, but still quickly enough that it won't take even an hour before the prologue's done and you just get a full party head-on for the rest of the game. So the opening is cool, the opening is stylish, the opening is also efficient, and the opening serves a well-designed purpose. So yeah, I'm gonna give this one a 10 out of 10, best JRPG opening ever. And while I'd love to talk about the game mechanics that those opening segments introduced right now, let's not jump right there and instead take a quick break to talk about the plot those characters introduced. Virginia Maxwell is a young woman who decides to set out from her small town to help people with the help of healthy dose of bullets. Gallo Carandine is a priest of sorts, who abandoned priesthood from his small village because fuck that, he wants freedom. Jet Enduro is an edgy hunter lone wolf type of guy, and Clive Winslet is a serious but kind-hearted sniper dude who is very professional when it comes to work and turns out is a family man. They are all drifters, who in the desert world of Filgaia are basically bounty hunting, treasure hunting, side quest doing JRPG protagonizing people. They're the usual adventurer trope, basically, but with a bit of a twist, a bit of a Wild West twist to it. Virginia believes that they were united by fate and convinces them to stick together after the wild train ride and go on the search for a mystical artifact known only as the Eternal Sparkle. It looks and feels at first like your typical good versus evil story, and I'm not gonna say it's not, because there is definitely a good side to this tale and a bad side, but Wild Arms 3's story is much more than that. Virginia, you see, it's a bit naive at the start. The wastelands of Filgaia are a harsh place filled with morally grey people just trying to live out their lives, and no one is quite as selfless as her. In fact, everyone who makes up her very own party have personal, sometimes pretty selfish motivations for participating in said party. And even she herself must learn to get a practical grasp on her own motivations as well, since just attempting to force her own ideas of selflessness and justice onto others can end up getting herself and her friends needlessly hurt as well, and making everything possibly worse. Finding that sweet spot between practicality and her own ideals while traveling around the world on the brink of destruction is what makes up her character arc, and it's a pretty good character arc. It's not supremely masterfully best arc ever, but it is enough to allow her to be an interesting character of her own and to be the emotional heart that connects all of the threads of each character's own individual arcs together as they all drive towards their respective conclusions, as they have their own personalities and motivations as well. It's a great party, and I personally think it's a very good story. Of course, the characters are strong, but beyond them, there is also a crazy plot filled with crazy lore. The search for the Eternal Sparkle doesn't really last beyond the first chapter of the game, and the game continues with the characters more or less stumbling from one dungeon to the next by asking the townspeople about what sort of dangerous ruins lies near their respective towns. It plays fast and loose with long-term goals in exchange for the more minute-to-minute ones, which can definitely make the point-to-point story feels disconnected when looked at the closest level, even if everything is tied neatly together at the overarching level. Of course, that is slowly phased out as the story gets more and more tightly constructed, and by the end, everything from point A to point B makes complete narrative and logical sense. But at the beginning, yeah, it feels a bit like a bunch of threads that have to be tied together yet. But what helps this, you go through the story in this world, is that the world is cool. It's a very cool looking Western world, and one thing that really shines, in my personal opinion, are the character designs, because they all look distinct, and they all have this very JRPG style, but they all exhibit a level of restraint and dedication to the Western aesthetic at the same time, which makes them immediately identifiable as Wild West characters, rather than just pulling, let's say, a Freedom Wars and going completely nuts, making everyone look like a fashion disaster regardless of the in-game lore. And of course, this review wouldn't be complete if I didn't mention that every time you load the game, an opening plays, and every time you quit, an ending plays, like a real TV anime. I've seen games that separated their chapters with previously on segments or openings and endings to make them feel like episodes of an anime or a TV series, but when you load the game and when you quit, I have to admit this is the first time I've seen this, and holy shit, why didn't they do that before? I mean, they did that a bunch of years ago, but why didn't they do more people do that more? Because it makes much more sense, and it adds such a hype sense when you start, and it's such a bittersweet departure when you stop playing. Bonus points for having the opening and ending slowly change as you complete chapters, so it can follow the crazy plot as it gets crazier and crazier and introduces new characters and threats. Yes, The 2D animated opening of this game changes as you play the game. This is some next level stuff, I love it. But of course, you didn't come here just to listen to that. You also want to know what makes Wild Arms 3 notable from a gameplay perspective. And it isn't, after all, your usual JRPG. It does play somewhat like your usual turn-based fare, but it does some things in quite a few different ways. Starting with the user interface, which instead of showing your possible commands in a generic top to bottom list, it instead opts to display them in a cross in the middle of the screen, allowing you to select from a total of 5 different actions by using the direction buttons before pressing on the face buttons to select the option, which is a weird middle path between old school style lists like, say, Final Fantasy 9 or something, or 7, and the new school style where you just press a button for an option like Persona 5. It is convenient, but not as convenient as the more recent examples. And yes, this totally needed its own paragraph because I'm obsessed with turn-based JRPG menus, so shut up. Going in other directions that normal people might care about, the real big change that I think makes this game very interesting is the way MP works. In here they're called force points, and you slowly charge them up during battle whenever your character lands an attack or he receives one. And once you break past the required amount of force points, you can use magic for absolutely free, because magic doesn't spend force points. So like, if a magic skill requires 8 force points, once you get 8 force points, you can use them unlimitedly for the rest of the battle. The magic skills for each character also depends on the guardian spirits, the medians you set into each character, which also changes their base stats and allows you to spend personal skill points to unlock passive abilities, and they basically allow you to create builds on each character, and it's a lot of fun to figure out which build fits better each character or the different possible builds you can do. However, each character also does have abilities that are unique to them regardless of their guardian spirits, and activating those abilities does cost force points. To compensate for that, those abilities are much more useful in direct or indirect ways than the magic ones. So knowing when to bust out the big ones, knowing that doing so will leave your character unable to use certain spells until you charge the points back up again, it all adds a very unique and a welcome extra layer of strategy that you need to consider in every encounter. Also unique to this game, and it's a given that it's a Western game, it's the fact that you shoot stuff with guns, but like actual guns, with bullets. And the bullets can run out, at which point you must spend a turn reloading them, and it's pretty great. And then there's also the fact that the unique FP skill of each character isn't a skill of its own, but rather a modifier of another action. So if, for example, your entire party is hurting, you can use a multiplier skill to multiply a single healing item so it affects the entire party. Or you can accelerate your character so he will be guaranteed to perform an action before every single ally or enemy. That action being either an offensive or a defensive one. It's all up to you. Oh, and there's this second skill of every character that it's the same. It's called Gatling, and that skill allows you to perform multiple shots with your weapon in a single turn. The amount of shots you can do based on the level of the force bar you're in, because as you go gathering force points, each quarter of your bar is like another force level, which is a very powerful tool and kind of complicated at first to understand. But again, if you don't have enough bullets, you just end up wasting the skill, as the later attacks will instead be done by hand and they will basically cause less damage to the enemy. And I think I'll stop it right here because there's plenty of cool strategic moves and maneuvers you can do in this game, and if I stayed here trying to exemplify every single one, would be here forever. So let's just say that my personal opinion is that the combat on this game is absolutely masterful. That's my final verdict. Adding to that masterfulness are the dungeons themselves. They expand in all kinds of directions, both horizontally and vertically, and every party member has their own set of tools aimed solely at helping to explore the dungeon or to solve unique puzzles, of which every dungeon has at least a few, meaning both inside and outside of battles, this game is just a really good time. Of course, there is a trade-off in the dungeon part, in that the dungeons are short and they have a lack of side rooms to explore. I mean, every single one does have side rooms and hidden chests that are a bit harder to get and you have to go out of your way, but most of the focus of each dungeon is on a kind of linear path that is focused on puzzle solving or using the unique traversal abilities you unlock throughout the game to reach the next point. And while it depends on how open you like your dungeons to be, I think it was a very fair trade-off, because even if the dungeons are kind of linear at times, they are just a complete joy to traverse, and they don't fall into the pitfall that so many JRPGs do of making their dungeons just empty corridors with locked doors. So, this is the part where I just rated 10 out of 10, an absolute masterpiece, and I recommend it to everyone, right? Well, no. It is true that the game is good. Hell, the game is great even, nearly godlike, no exaggeration, but that's the key word, isn't it? Nearly. Because unfortunately, the game is dragged down by a lot of annoyances and contrivances and bad design decisions. Look, I'm not going to say it's because it's an old game, and that old games are bad and the new games are good and that kind of thing, and I personally don't believe games can age badly. That's a discussion for another day, but in my personal opinion, and something I think you need to get the context of my complaints going from here on out, is that games are either good once and good forever, or they were never that great, but you put up with them because there was nothing else available that scratched that itch. So believe me when I say, Wild Arms' 3 bad parts aren't bad because the game is old. They're not a result of old school game design. They were unfortunately always bad, and most of them are not the result of old school game design. They are the result of the game's penchant for experimentation rather than following any old conventions. And that is the dark part of experimentation most of us nerds that like new things don't like to talk about. Is that even if risks are taken, there's a chance that there is no payoff, and in fact, it might be downright detrimental to the rest of the experience. So this part is kind of painful for me to write, so I didn't write anything really. Let just me bumble through my cliff notes. Okay, so let's start with quest markers. Old JRPGs don't have quest markers. A lot of people don't like them, they're a very controversial topic. I love them because I have no sense of direction. But that never really stopped me from playing an old school JRPG, because even if you have no sense of direction or quest markers, you can kind of talk with people and figure out where to go next. And the same is true here to a point. That point being that directions can be incredibly vague. You have to talk to random NPCs, and sometimes the game doesn't even tell you what NPC you have to talk to. You just kind of have to go to a random town and figure out that one is going to give you directions, and then he's going to say stuff like, oh, if you go north from here, there's the next dungeon, except he doesn't mention that there are canyons, that there are mountains, that it might be on another continent, and that north from here is an incredibly vague direction. And to make matters worse, you can't actually see things. You can't look north and see a giant mountain and say, oh, that is the mountain, that is the dungeon, because the game works on a scan system where you have to run around the map scanning it to find things in it, and that just adds a layer of bullshit that it's god, finding things sometimes the directions are specific down to the point of telling you the coordinates. They tell you the latitude and the longitude of where you have to go, and those moments are rare but incredible. Sometimes they'll say stuff like, don't cross the bridge, it's right there, and it is incredibly helpful, and other times it will be maddeningly vague and you can't even use the landscape as a sort of way to figure out where it is, because you have to scan stuff for stuff to appear in the first place. That's ridiculous. The second thing is that you can't escape from battles. That's a lie, technically. You can escape from battles hours in the game after you unlock a Guardian Spirit that has escape as a skill, but otherwise you can't, because The game has this system where it has something called ECN, is a gauge that whenever you're going to start a random encounter, exclamation point pops up on top of a character's head, and if you press a circle, you can skip the battle, but you spend part of your ECN gauge. And that is ridiculous because not only eventually your gauge is going to not going to work anymore because you don't have enough ECN, but not only that, it's kind of a fast thing that happens out of nowhere, and sometimes you don't want to skip a battle, sometimes you want to skip a battle, and you have seconds of reaction time. No, seconds would be too much, it would be enough. You have like 1 second, a few frames to press the circle button before you're thrown into battle with no possibility of escape until hours in. And that really screwed me up early in the game because thanks to the lack of directions, I ended up in a high level area and the monsters basically destroyed my character. That was still in the prologue, and I couldn't escape the battle and go where I was supposed to be. All I could do was die and just stay dead and basically reload my save to a lot earlier, and it felt kind of like bullshit, like, oh, tough battles right next to the easy battles wouldn't be so bad, it would be kind of fun in a exploration sense if I could escape from battles, but I couldn't. And to make things even worse, the battles can interrupt and reset dungeon puzzles. That's right, some puzzles, not all of them, just a few of them, but some puzzles you can actually get your progress reset if you get into a random battle, but it's a random battle system. When do you know you're going to get into a random battle? Better save that ECN gauge for the puzzles, boys. Luckily, not a lot of them don't, but that doesn't make it any less frustrating when you are using all of your brain power to solve a puzzle and suddenly battle that you can't even escape from. Alright, the other thing is the awkwardly stiff controls during the dungeons. Normally you wouldn't care about awkwardly stiff controls in a turn-based battle system. You just trigger a battle, well, you're turn-based, you don't have to. But because there are puzzles that are timed and there are puzzles that require you to place your character in very specific positions in order to accomplish them, having stiff controls during dungeons actually hurt the game a lot and make it a lot more frustrating. There are systems like the weapon reloading or the weapon upgrading system, which has they are awkwardly explained only long after you first needed them. They are not really that explained. What does of the stuff you can do with weapon upgrading? What does the stat actually affect? Well, I hope you open the wiki page and look there, because it's not in game. It doesn't give you a good sense of what to upgrade to better make your character in a certain direction. And there are no shops in the cities. There is only one guy where you can buy things from, and he's a wandering traveler, and he is not necessarily there when you get into the city. And he follows a pattern. There is later in the game, very later in the game, you can get a book that explains the pattern of the cities he can appear on, the pattern he sort of follows around the world. And it's a very interesting system, and would be if it's not for the fact that he is the only place where you can buy things. He's not the only place where you can sell things, but he is the only place where you can buy things. And those things include items that remove status effects, and the game's enemies love to shove 1,000 status effects down your throat. So whenever you see him, you better buy everything. You better buy a bunch of stuff, because you don't know what is going to fuck you up in the next dungeon, and you don't know when you're going to see him again, which is incredibly frustrating at times. A good thing is that not all of them, but a lot of the status effect items are very, very, very reasonably priced. So this is just a small frustration. If you see him, and don't let him go, buy a lot of things. You can be like, but I need the money to heal, but I want to upgrade my weapons and stuff. Well, too bad, you don't know what you're going to face, so you might as well buy 1,000 antidotes right now. You never know if the next dungeon is going to have poison. And of course, there is something that might please the hardcore fans, but are definitely going to throw the casuals away. It's the lack of health items. You live in a desert. It's a desert planet, and thus there is a lack of fruit. You can plant it. You can there's an optional dungeon and an optional side quest that lets you plant your own little garden of fruit, but you have to wait until that fruit is ready to harvest and stuff. And you can find health items in boxes and enemies and stuff, but it's like a random drop. You can just buy health items. The game works on a vitality system where after each battle, every time you rest, your character's vitality goes to full, and every time a battle ends, you spend part of the vitality gauge to get your health back, which is great. It sounds like it's very convenient at first, but it's there to compensate for the lack of health items. And at first I didn't know that, and I ended up like, oh, my vitality is over. Instead of going back and rest, I'm just gonna spend a ton of health items. But don't do that. Health items, especially effective ones, can be quite rare, and that can really fuck you up. Even if it's based on the theme of the game, it's a kind of a decision that makes everything a little bit harder. Thankfully not too much harder, since they're not rare, super rare, but you can't buy them, you can't stock them, so you really need to think when to use them. Okay, so I'm done with my bitching, my nagging, my whining. It is that, but it's honest. I have to be honest about how I felt when I review games. And while some of this stuff can be chalked up to some minor stuff, and you might think that, oh, it's not that bad, but it is minor stuff that accompanies you throughout the entire game, constantly annoying you and interrupting you, and it made me constantly stop to look at walkthroughs and videos so I knew where to go. And with each interruption is another moment in which I question if I was actually having any fun, and instead deciding to do something else until I dragged myself back to the game and realized that yeah, it was in fact very fun, I was having fun, but at least until the next interruption, the next snag. The game is only 20 to 30 hours long, even more if you try to be to 100% completion, of course, and I could easily devour it in a weekend, yet it took me a month to finish it. It took me a month to finish this relatively short game. And that's because of all of the bad decisions they took. They just made things a mess to trudge to at times, even though the game is actually really, really fun and really, really good. And every time I was like, oh, maybe it's going to get better, maybe I'm going to unlock things. And in the case of Escape, the lack of escape, it certainly turned out to be true. I certainly turned out to unlock something. But the truth is, it doesn't matter which god you pray to, from beginning to end, those things are going to stick in the game, and those things are going to drag the entire experience down. And that sucks. But maybe those won't bother you. Maybe those won't bother you at all. Maybe you'll be like, oh, this guy is whining a lot about a bunch of stuff that sounds very interesting. And in that case, man, this game is for you. Because if it wasn't for these things, I would label this game a complete masterpiece. The kind of game that I wonder why it isn't praised in the same realm as the classics like Final Fantasy VII, because it's a really, really good game. These things that I mentioned, they drag the good game down. They don't make it a bad game. They drag the greatness to almost greatness, in my personal opinion. And that's it. I personally think this game is fantastic, except for those things that I just mentioned, and it's a hidden gem. I mean, everyone who played it speaks highly of it, but not everyone has played it, and it speaks volumes that Sony decided to bring it to the PS4, but I don't see it sung in the same praises that I think it should be. It's great. It's fantastic. And since everyone has a boner for remakes these days, my vote definitely goes to this one. Remake it without the bullshit. Don't try to actionize it, please. Leave it turn-based. The force point system is fantastic. You should just upgrade the graphics, remove these flaws, and re-release it. There is a re-release on PS4, but it's just a complete re-release. It's just remastered. They really need to do it. If you want to remake something, remake Wild Arms 3 or make Wild Arms 6. Why not? Why did this franchise die? If every game in this franchise has the level of quality this game has, it's a great franchise, and I look forward to experiencing other games in it. And I'm rambling and ranting at this point, so let's just finish it here. Thank you for listening to the very end. Like if you like, dislike if you dislike, subscribe if you want to see more stuff that I got that is coming soon. Yeah, the usual YouTube stuff, whatever. See you guys next time. No, wait, that outro was terrible. How about I sign you guys off with a little lullaby? I believe this one is called Advanced Wind.